Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, John's backyard was his sanctuary until his entitled neighbor Steve turned his summer shower into a battleground. What began as an innocent escape quickly spiraled into trespassing, hot water pranks, and a courtroom showdown that tested the limits of boundaries, justice, and patience. John had always taken pride in his home, a quaint property nestled in a suburban American neighborhood where privacy felt like a luxury. After months of planning and hands-on effort, he transformed his backyard into a personal oasis, a wooden deck, a garden brimming with wildflowers, and his crowning achievement, a summer shower. The outdoor fixture wasn't just practical, it was a symbol of his labor and a quiet retreat where he could wash away the stress of his engineering job. The backyard was John's sanctuary, a slice of serenity where he felt completely at ease. Life in the neighborhood, however, wasn't without its quirks. Most of his neighbors were pleasant enough, but one in particular stood out: Steve, who lived 2 doors down. Steve was the kind of neighbor who always seemed to overstep boundaries, his brash confidence often rubbing others the wrong way. Known for his tendency to borrow tools without asking and park slightly too close to others' driveways, Steve operated with an air of entitlement. At first, John hadn't noticed anything unusual about the summer shower. On most days, it stood idle unless he or his wife used it after gardening or a workout. But one Saturday, returning home early from a morning jog, John caught a glimpse of Steve exiting his backyard. Dressed in shorts and flip-flops, Steve carried a towel casually slung over his shoulder. His wet hair glistened in the sun, unmistakable evidence of what he had just done. John's brow furrowed as he approached the fence. "Hey, Steve, were you just in my backyard?" Steve didn't miss a beat. "Oh, hey, John. Yeah, I hope you don't mind. I just needed a quick rinse. Your setup's fantastic, by the way. You've got great water pressure." John's jaw tightened. "It's private property, Steve. You could have asked." Steve waved dismissively. "Didn't think you'd mind. It's just water, right?" As Steve strolled away, John felt a pang of frustration. This wasn't the first time Steve had blurred the lines of decency, but trespassing to use the shower felt like a step too far. Determined to keep his peace, John decided to let it slide. This time, little did he know, this single encounter would mark the beginning of a frustrating and escalating conflict, one that would soon turn his tranquil backyard into the center of a heated neighborhood drama. The audacity of Steve's casual intrusion lingered in John's mind for days. He replayed their brief exchange, growing increasingly irritated at the neighbor's dismissive attitude. John had worked hard to create his backyard haven, and the idea of someone exploiting his effort without permission gnawed at him. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became to address the issue. Initially, John took the direct approach. A couple of days after the incident, he knocked on Steve's door. "Look, Steve, I need to make this clear," John said, trying to keep his tone calm but firm. "That shower is on my private property. It's not for public use." Steve smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "Come on, John. It's just a shower. What's the big deal? It's not like I'm stealing your car." John clenched his fists at his sides. "It's about respect. Please, stay out of my backyard." Steve shrugged and offered a vague, non-committal "sure thing," which only fueled John's suspicion that his neighbor wasn't taking him seriously. The next weekend, John's fears were confirmed. Reviewing footage from a newly installed security camera, he saw Steve strolling into his backyard with the same casual air. Steve turned on the shower, rinsed off leisurely, and left as if the space were his own. This time, John decided that a simple warning wasn't enough. He needed a creative way to discourage Steve without escalating the situation further. That's when the idea struck him. What if the shower became less inviting? That evening, John went to the plumbing controls and shut off the cold water supply to the outdoor shower, leaving only the hot water running. It wasn't dangerous. John ensured the temperature wouldn't scald, but it would certainly make for an uncomfortable experience. Satisfied with his plan, John monitored the camera footage over the next few days. He didn't have to wait long. On a sunny Tuesday afternoon, Steve once again sauntered into John's backyard, towel in hand. The camera captured the exact moment the hot water hit him. Steve yelped in surprise, recoiling from the stream and fumbling with the controls in vain. The temperature was more than he'd bargained for, and within seconds he was out of the shower, muttering curses under his breath. Later that evening, John received a text message from Steve. Seriously, what's with the water? Not cool, man." John's response was curt. "Stay off my property, and it won't be an issue." But Steve wasn't the type to back down easily. Over the next few days, his demeanor shifted from annoyance to outright hostility. When they passed each other on the street, Steve's usual casual nods were replaced with icy glares. He began complaining to other neighbors, spinning a story that painted John as a petty and unneighborly tyrant. John, however, wasn't fazed. He felt justified in his actions. After all, Steve had brought this on himself by repeatedly violating boundaries. Still, something told him this was far from over. Steve wasn't just upset, he was plotting his next move. The fallout from John's clever water trick quickly spiraled into a full-blown neighborhood spectacle. Steve, humiliated by his hot shower mishap, wasted no time spinning the narrative to frame himself as the victim. By midweek, murmurs had spread through the neighborhood, carried on the winds of Steve's exaggerated retelling of events. According to Steve's version, John had maliciously booby-trapped the shower, creating a deliberate hazard to harm anyone who used it. Over coffee chats and mailbox greetings, neighbors began whispering about the feud. Some laughed it off as typical Steve drama, while others started viewing John in a harsher light. Steve didn't stop at gossip. He took his grievances to the local homeowners association. Though John's property technically lay outside the HOA's jurisdiction, Steve passionately argued during an open forum that John's actions were a threat to community harmony. He could have seriously injured someone, Steve proclaimed, waving his hands theatrically. "It's about safety, people. What if a kid wandered into that yard?" Despite the lack of actual jurisdiction, the HOA board begrudgingly agreed to send John a letter urging cooperation and neighborly conduct. John chuckled as he read the carefully worded note, which reeked of placation rather than authority. But Steve wasn't satisfied with an HOA slap on the wrist. He filed a formal complaint with the city, alleging that John's shower created unsafe conditions and violated municipal codes. The complaint triggered an inspection, and John was soon greeted by a city official on his doorstep. "Mr. Parker, I'm here to conduct a property inspection," the official said, clipboard in hand. "We received a report about a potential safety issue with your outdoor shower." John, ever the pragmatist, calmly escorted the inspector to the backyard and provided a detailed explanation of the shower's setup, including its purpose and recent use, or misuse. He also shared footage from the security camera, highlighting Steve's repeated trespassing. The inspector's face tightened with each clip, and he eventually sighed. "Well, Mr. Parker, it's clear this isn't a safety violation. If anything, the issue lies with your neighbor crossing onto private property. I'll be closing this case." Though vindicated, John felt the familiar churn of frustration. Steve's antics were becoming a real disruption, and the inspector's words did little to stop the neighbor from escalating further. Steve, emboldened by the neighborhood gossip, doubled down on his campaign to vilify John. Passive-aggressive notes began appearing on John's mailbox. "This isn't how good neighbors act. You're the reason we can't have nice things." At one point, Steve left a crudely drawn community agreement suggesting shared use of the backyard, complete with an unsigned note. "Be reasonable." John was unfazed by the notes, but wary of Steve's growing boldness. He could see the wheels turning behind those icy glares. Steve wasn't just angry, he was gearing up for a more direct confrontation. For now, John stayed firm, drawing strength from the knowledge that he had done nothing wrong. Still, as tension mounted, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to take a more serious turn. The knock on John's door came early one morning, accompanied by the stern voice of a delivery man. "Legal documents for Mr. John Parker," the man announced, handing over a thick envelope. John opened it with a sinking feeling. Inside was an official-looking complaint. Steve had filed a lawsuit against him, alleging negligence, intentional infliction of harm, and even emotional distress. John skimmed the contents, his frustration mounting with each paragraph. According to Steve, John had deliberately altered the shower to cause physical harm, resulting in burns, emotional trauma, and a damaged reputation in the community. The demands were outrageous: compensation for medical bills, an apology, and a complete restoration of access to the shower. Steve's audacity left John in stunned disbelief. "This guy just doesn't quit," John muttered, dialing his attorney, Rachel Davis. She was a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer who had helped him settle a property dispute years ago. After hearing the details, Rachel didn't mince words. "This is a textbook, frivolous lawsuit," she said. "But frivolous or not, it still needs to be handled seriously. He's banking on the inconvenience and cost, forcing you to settle. Don't let him." Over the next week, Rachel and John prepared a rock-solid defense. They compiled property records proving the shower was fully within John's privately owned land, security footage showing Steve's repeated trespassing, and even the water temperature settings, which were well below the level needed to cause serious harm. Steve's case hinges on painting himself as an innocent victim, Rachel explained during a strategy meeting. "Our goal is to show the court the truth. He trespassed knowingly, ignored warnings, and essentially brought this on himself." When the court date arrived, John found himself seated in a small but formal courtroom, his nerves steady but alert. Steve, on the other hand, entered with a confident swagger, his lawyer by his side. Steve wore an exaggerated neck brace, as if to punctuate his claim of physical harm. The proceedings began with Steve's lawyer painting a dramatic picture of his alleged suffering. "My client trusted his neighbor to maintain a safe environment, but instead, he was subjected to a cruel and dangerous act. The burns he suffered have caused him immense pain, both physically and emotionally. This behavior is unacceptable in a civilized community." Steve nodded along with every word, casting occasional pitying glances at the judge. Then it was Rachel's turn. With a calm yet authoritative tone, she dismantled Steve's narrative piece by piece. She began by presenting video footage from John's security camera, which clearly showed Steve entering the backyard without permission. The court watched as Steve casually turned on the shower, only to yelp and flee moments later. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're seeing is not a man innocently caught in harm's way," Rachel said, her voice steady. "This is a neighbor who, despite multiple warnings, willfully trespassed onto private property for personal convenience. The water temperature was safe, but uncomfortable, a deliberate measure to deter unauthorized use. Mr. Parker's actions were protective, not harmful." Next, Rachel presented a log of neighborhood disputes involving Steve. From borrowing tools without returning them to encroaching on others' property, the evidence painted a clear picture of a habitual boundary pusher. Steve's lawyer attempted to object, claiming the prior incidents were irrelevant. But Rachel countered, arguing that they established a pattern of disregard for personal boundaries, which was directly relevant to the case. The judge agreed, allowing the evidence to remain. By the time John took the stand, the tide had visibly turned. Calm and measured, he recounted his interactions with Steve, his efforts to maintain peace, and the steps he took to safeguard his property without escalating the situation. "I didn't want conflict," John told the court, "but Steve left me no choice. This is my home, my sanctuary. I shouldn't have to defend it against someone who doesn't respect the simplest rules of decency." Rachel closed her argument with a decisive statement. The plaintiff's injuries, minor as they are, were entirely self-inflicted. Mr. Parker acted within his rights to protect his property. This lawsuit is not about justice. It's about manipulation and entitlement. We ask the court to dismiss these baseless claims and hold the plaintiff accountable for his actions. Your Honor, my client is a hard-working, respected member of this community who has suffered grievously due to Mr. Parker's reckless and malicious actions. The installation of a scalding water trap is nothing short of premeditated harm. My client trusted his neighbor to act in good faith, only to be met with deliberate cruelty. He deserves justice. Steve, seated beside his lawyer, nodded solemnly, occasionally wincing as if recalling his supposed trauma. His dramatics drew quiet murmurs from the gallery, but John remained composed. His time to speak was coming. Rachel rose with measured confidence, walking to the center of the room. Your Honor, the plaintiff's claims are not only baseless, but egregiously misleading. The defense will show that this lawsuit is a thinly veiled attempt to manipulate the legal system after Mr. Carter repeatedly ignored boundaries and warnings, leading to consequences entirely of his own making. With that, Rachel presented her centerpiece evidence: the security footage. The video played on the courtroom screen showing Steve's nonchalant entry into John's backyard. It captured him turning on the shower, recoiling at the hot water, and then stumbling away while muttering expletives. The imagery was clear, vivid, and devastating to Steve's case. "This footage," Rachel said, pausing to let the courtroom absorb what they'd just seen, "is indisputable proof that Mr. Carter was fully aware he was trespassing. He ignored posted signs, ignored verbal warnings, and knowingly used a private facility without permission. He was not harmed by malice, but by his own audacious behavior." Steve's lawyer tried to pivot, claiming that the hot water temperature was unsafe. But Rachel was prepared. She presented maintenance logs showing that the water temperature was regulated and fell well within standard safety guidelines. The shower was uncomfortable, yes, she admitted, but it was not dangerous. "And discomfort, Your Honor, does not constitute grounds for a lawsuit." Next came the testimonies. John took the stand first, his demeanor calm and precise. He described his repeated attempts to address the issue with Steve directly before resorting to measures to protect his property. "I wanted to avoid conflict," he explained, "but after countless warnings were ignored, I took action to discourage further trespassing. I never intended to harm anyone, only to safeguard what's mine." Rachel followed with a series of witnesses from the neighborhood. Each testified about Steve's pattern of boundary-pushing behavior, from borrowing items without returning them to parking in driveways without asking. One neighbor even shared how Steve had once entered their backyard uninvited, claiming he needed to borrow their hose. Steve's lawyer objected, arguing that these stories were irrelevant. But the judge overruled, noting their significance in establishing a pattern of conduct. When it was Steve's turn to testify, his performance bordered on absurd. He recounted the incident with overwrought detail, dramatically describing the searing pain and shock of the hot water. But under cross-examination, Rachel quickly unraveled his narrative. "So, Mr. Carter," she began, "you claim you had no idea the shower was private property?" I thought it was shared," Steve stammered. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Shared? Despite the private property signs? Despite Mr. Parker asking you to stay off his land?" Steve shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't think he really meant it." "And yet," Rachel pressed, "you continued to use the shower after multiple warnings, knowing full well it wasn't yours. Isn't that correct?" Caught. Steve muttered something inaudible, his confidence visibly shaken. When the closing statements arrived, Rachel delivered a sharp and decisive argument. "Your Honor, this case isn't about injury or negligence. It's about entitlement. Mr. Carter trespassed, ignored warnings, and then had the audacity to file a lawsuit when his actions had natural consequences. The law is clear. Private property is to be respected. Anything less undermines the very foundation of community and individual rights." The judge's decision was swift. He dismissed Steve's case entirely, ruling in John's favor. Furthermore, he ordered Steve to pay all court fees and an additional sum for emotional distress. The judge's final words were damning. "Mr. Carter, this court does not reward those who seek to abuse the law for personal gain. You trespassed knowingly and willfully, and you alone are responsible for the consequences. Case dismissed." As the gavel struck, John exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. He glanced at Steve, whose face was a mix of disbelief and humiliation. Justice had prevailed, but John knew this wasn't just about him. It was a message to anyone who thought they could trample on the rights of others without consequence. The courtroom victory should have marked the end of John's ordeal, but Steve wasn't the kind of man to let a public defeat fade quietly into the background. In the days following the judge's verdict, John began to notice subtle but unmistakable signs of Steve's brewing resentment. First, there was the change in Steve's demeanor. Gone was the smugness and overconfidence that had characterized him during the trial. Now, Steve's interactions were marked by simmering hostility. He avoided eye contact during neighborhood gatherings, but made a point of loudly grumbling whenever John's name came up in conversation. Soon, Steve's bitterness escalated into petty acts of revenge. One morning, John found a pile of leaves inexplicably dumped at the edge of his driveway. Odd, considering it was spring and the trees were bare. Another day, his mailbox was mysteriously tipped over, though no other homes on the street were affected. While these incidents were minor annoyances, John suspected they were no coincidence. The real trouble began a week later when John received a surprise visit from a local zoning inspector. "We've had a complaint about potential code violations on your property," the inspector said, clipboard in hand. John's irritation flared. He knew immediately who was behind this. Despite his frustration, John cooperated fully. He walked the inspector through his backyard, pointing out every detail of his meticulously maintained property. The shower, which had sparked the initial conflict, was deemed entirely up to code. The inspector left satisfied, but John knew the hassle wasn't over. Steve's antics didn't end there. Late one evening, as John was reviewing footage from his security camera, he spotted a familiar figure lingering near his fence line. Steve appeared to be holding a canister, which he tipped over along the base of the fence before disappearing into the night. The next morning, a pungent smell confirmed John's suspicion. Steve had poured a chemical along the fence, killing the grass in a straight line. It was the final straw. John filed a police report detailing the escalating acts of harassment and providing the footage as evidence. While the officer who came to investigate couldn't make an immediate arrest, he promised to speak with Steve and issue a formal warning. True to form, Steve didn't take the warning well. Word spread quickly among the neighbors, and Steve attempted to twist the narrative, claiming John was out to ruin his life. But the community was no longer buying into his tales. The court's verdict had cast Steve in a new light, one of a bitter, entitled man who couldn't accept responsibility for his actions. As Steve's reputation crumbled, his interactions with the neighbors dwindled to awkward silences and cold glares. Within weeks, a for sale sign appeared in his front yard, signaling that he had finally decided to leave the neighborhood. For John, Steve's departure was bittersweet. He was relieved to see the end of the constant tension, but he couldn't help feeling a twinge of pity for the man who had brought so much chaos upon himself. While John had defended his rights and won decisively, he was left reflecting on how pride and stubbornness could destroy relationships and reputations alike. With Steve gone, peace gradually returned to the neighborhood. The air seemed lighter, the community friendlier, and John, ever pragmatic, reinforced his property boundaries with new fencing and additional cameras, determined to protect the serenity he had worked so hard to create. With Steve's departure, the neighborhood settled into a newfound calm, as if a storm had finally passed. The absence of his lingering hostility was palpable, and for the first time in months, John felt a deep sense of relief. His backyard once again became the sanctuary he had intended it to be, a private retreat where he could enjoy the simple pleasures of life without interruption. John reflected on the tumultuous ordeal and the lessons it had brought to light. The experience had reinforced the importance of standing up for his rights, even when faced with persistent opposition. It wasn't easy to confront someone like Steve, manipulative, entitled, and unyielding. But the victory wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about defending personal boundaries and setting a precedent for mutual respect in the community. In the weeks following the resolution, John noticed a change among his neighbors. Conversations seemed warmer, more open, as if the tension Steve had injected into the community had lifted. A few neighbors even stopped by to commend John for his perseverance. "You showed us it's okay to push back when someone crosses the line," one remarked. The incident also brought unexpected personal growth. John realized the value of clear communication and decisive action in resolving conflicts. While he wished things hadn't escalated to a courtroom, he was proud of how he had handled the situation with integrity. To celebrate the return of normalcy, John hosted a small gathering in his backyard, inviting neighbors to enjoy the very space that had sparked so much turmoil. As he watched his guests laugh and mingle, John felt a quiet satisfaction. His yard was no longer just a place. It was a symbol of resilience and restored peace. In the end, justice had been served, not just for John, but for the neighborhood as a whole. The experience became a reminder to everyone that while conflicts can disrupt harmony, they can also pave the way for clarity, respect, and a stronger sense of community.